are talking Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and this one is directed by Bill Zebub, a prolific B-movie horror director with such classics as Dick Shark, for example. So you might be thinking the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is actually going to be a comedy, and I believe, from what I understand, it started out when it was being produced with the idea of being a kind of a parody, but it's actually not. It features two groups of people, primarily this group of New Yorkers travelling down to Texas to try and see the local sights, you might say, and they encounter a group of Texas locals and inevitably start kind of making fun of them. And this kind of starts a tit-for-tat kind of essentially war between these two groups of people, with gradually escalating consequences resulting in some gruesome deaths. What will happen? You will have to watch the movie and find out. So let's discuss Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I keep nearly saying it. Anyway, what works in this movie? I've got to say, I actually think this is quite a neat idea, and it's quite self-referential in regards to the obviously Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You know, and we have sort of commentary on how, you know, for example, our New York, cast are kind of making commentary on and why do people from this kind of area in Texas speak in a certain way, and you know, their grammar and things, and they're obviously making commentary on things like the kind of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and stuff like that. So it's obviously quite self-referential, and I have to say I quite like the idea that it's ultimately a culture war movie. This one what it comes down to is the different ideologies of these kind of two types of people, and they don't get on, and they have problems with one another, and what ultimately started out as, you know, a war of words, so to speak, escalates into kind of violence. So it actually does have some quite mature themes, despite this movie being really a schlocky kind of B-movie. So despite its kind of like silliness, and it is silly, yeah, it does actually have a little bit of thought behind it, in actual fact. There's actually some reasonable characterization here as well. For example, we have the kind of, I guess really the leader of our Texas group of people, who is this kind of blonde young woman. I mean, she looks a little young, to be honest, to be the kind of the matriarch of this family, but nonetheless, you know, and she actually comes across as having some, you know, some reasonable gravitas in her kind of performance, and it was like, wow. I mean, the budget for this, from what I understand, was around $6,000, and it was a crowdfunded movie. So, you know, it's a reasonable effort for such a kind of a low budget movie that actually does have some kind of relevance, certainly in today's kind of culture. In regards to VFX and kind of gore and stuff, it's not as much as you'd probably think, but there's a reasonable bit certainly towards the end, and I think there's one sequence where someone ultimately gets chainsawed that I think is done with some decent kind of practical effects and things like this. The movie does have this kind of, you know, makes you feel a little uneasy at times. For example, early on, when our Texan group of characters effectively take most of these kind of New Yorkers kind of captive, and they make the one female of the group do a kind of a striptease for the, you know, the rest of them, and with these New Yorkers kind of tied up, and they're making them kind of watch this, and it's meant to be, you know, making them feel uneasy and kind of like ultimately, you know, predatory. And I think it does succeed actually in having that kind of feeling of kind of unease, despite it being a kind of a schlocky B movie. One thing that I think may be a bit, you know, divisive, to be honest, is the music. It kind of almost has this constant kind of musical kind of overlay, kind of going through more the whole movie. It feels like I never feel like it ever ended. But I've got to say, it's kind of this tense kind of like, not exactly music exactly, but kind of like these kind of like sound effects almost that are kind of running sort of musical kind of sound effects is the best way to describe it, that kind of running nearly the whole way through the film. And there's a couple of music songs and stuff, but I don't know, it added to the kind of the tension. Some people might find it samey. I actually kind of found it somewhat kind of effective, to be honest with you. So what doesn't work in this movie's favour? It is obviously a very, very low budget film. The biggest critique I'd say is it needed to have some severe editing done to it. There is scenes where they are just massively overlong, and I think the film thinks it's having these scenes of great pathos and kind of like emotional beats. For example, we've got one of our kind of New York friends who's sort of not with the main group, the majority, when he sort of discovers what's happening, he's all like, oh, pissed off at the world and kind of screaming at God. And it literally goes on for about 10 minutes with this kind of like this blue kind of filter. And I'm not kidding, about 10 minutes, and it just goes on forever in kind of slow-mo, and it's just like, it borders on a little stupid, I have to be honest. But that's not the only instance. There's a lot of sequences here where slow-mo is overused, and we have these stretched out scenes where someone is just kind of, oh, this is bad, and whatever, and it just goes on and on and on and on. This needed to have some severe edits. Maybe that would have affected the running time, which would lead me on to my next thing. I think this movie could have had some more scenes in it, to be honest with you. I mean, like the setup, there isn't one. I think this movie could have benefited from having a setup. I think this, coming from a prolific B-movie, producer and director, he wanted to do it his way, doesn't want to do things commercially, etc., etc. But I think it suffers because of that. I think the movie could have been a little bit more structured, a little bit more to it, introducing the characters a little earlier on, giving us a little bit more kind of backstory towards them, and setting up this kind of these two groups of individuals. When it comes down to it, there's not a hell of a lot of story, to be honest with you. It feels like things are kind of stretched out. The idea is solid, the basic synopsis is solid, but when it comes down to it, the actual plot, or lack thereof, does kind of show. Some of the kind of the dialogue sequences feel like there's a little bit of a pause before people kind of start their dialogue. Again, it comes down to the editing. There needed to be a little bit, half a second before each kind of line of dialogue where people are giving like a cue, and then they start speaking, because that's what it feels like. It feels like someone's got a cue, and then they start speaking, but you have that kind of second or so before they speak. It's low budget. The acting isn't brilliant from some of them. The kind of the VFX are a bit rubbery. The pig face guy looks like a plastic mask, not an actual kind of pig face. It suffers from very low budget itis, so to speak. But it's an average film, I would say, for a B-movie kind of fan. 5 out of 10. It's a good idea. It just needed a little bit more work, if you ask me, a little bit more to it. It was a little lacking in kind of story and setup and things, but it was better than I was expecting. 5 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.